Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This week we're continuing a conversation that we paused on the last episode because we ran out of time, but we want to continue talking about it. We were talking about insecurity last week on the show, and we wanted to get to applying this idea and concept of insecurity toward personality types, or at least the cognitive functions in personality types. And we never got to it because we just ended up in this free-form conversation. It was a really great conversation. So if you haven't heard that, go back and listen because we're going to build off some of the principles we talked about on that show. I think it was a good conversation. You're smiling.
I'm smiling because I did too much talking.
When I said it was a good conversation, you smiled. I'm like, wait, was it not a good conversation? I thought it was a good conversation.
I thought it was a great conversation. And also, I know that I did a lot of talking.
It's fine. Don't worry about it. It's good. I'm glad you do. You bring good stuff when you talk, so it's all cool. You should do talking. It's great. I'll just interrupt you if I need to say something.
Okay.
What was my theory? Oh, as we were preparing for this show, a thought came to me that could start us out, then we can get to some of the types. But I realized that before my grandparents died, at least my grandfathers, but also my grandmothers as well, they had no insecurity by the end of their lives. Like by the time they were in their 80s, like the stuff that they would say or do or anything, like they could care less what anyone thought about them. But I noticed like my children, as they're approaching middle school age, they care very much how they're perceived, like to the point where it's kind of crazy, like it's absurd, right? And I remember myself as a middle schooler, age 12, 13, caring greatly about all sorts of things that I thought were important. Now, at my age now, I'm looking back like, why was I worried about that at all? And I'm kind of guessing that older people too have this experience. At 85, you look back at a 40-year-old and go, dude, it's going to be fine. Don't stress about that thing. You don't need to be insecure about that. And I guess it's a general rhetorical question that I have. Is this idea of insecurity, is it something that the youth deals with, like we deal with when we're young more than when we're old? And is it something that just naturally eradicates itself? Or do you think my grandparents' generation, or my grandparents in particular, did a lot of work around their insecurity as they grew older? And that's why do you think they were, I don't think they worked on themselves. I guess I'll just say this. I think it's just something that naturally happened as they got older. I don't think they weren't like personally growth focused. I mean, they were decent people and they always wanted to be better themselves, but it was not like they were like really trying to work on their personal growth issues in the later parts of their life. Like they were tired, they're watching TV every day, they're just chilling at home, but they kept getting less and less insecure over time. It was a really weird phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't ask me this before you hit record, so I haven't thought about this at all, so I'm going to give you just a spontaneous response.
Well, that's probably why I didn't ask you this, because I kind of wanted a free-form discussion to start around it.
Yeah, and I think it's a really compelling question. I suspect, of course, I have to see everything through systems thinking, so it's always nodes in a system, right? Why is lack of insecurity the emergence of people who are older, and in particular your grandparents? And I would say that there's probably a couple nodes that are relevant. One, I do think that people, like your grandparents died in the last 10 years, all four of them, right?
Yeah.
And they were all people who were into their 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
So we're talking like people who were born at the beginning of the last century, effectively.
90 or older. I think 3 of them died at 90, and then my grandmother just passed away this past year at 95.
Yeah, so they were all born in like the teens and 20s?
19 through 23, yeah.
Okay. So they were born at a a difficult time. They were born in difficult times, but they were simpler times compared to now. And so I suspect that one of the reasons why so many people are into development and growth these days is because we have such complicated times that we're living in. It's not that our lives are harder, although we think they are. Our lives are actually quite soft and easy, but they're very complex. And so I think that it is easier to feel secure in a simpler context because there's very little that you have to grapple with.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that's one node.
Yeah, because you picked in the 1950s, when you're an adult, you picked your church, you picked your social club, like the Lions Club, or I mean, at least here in the United States. I'm obviously coming from a U.S. perspective. You picked your social club, your church, whatever brand, Presbyterian, Catholic. This is kind of like gray Americana, right? Like the Norman Rockwell vision of it. And you picked your friends, you picked your career, and then that lasted for 40 years till you retired, and then you kind of just lived off the fumes of that until you pass away.
Yeah, and there were some subgroups that had a more complicated experience of it, right?
Of course.
Because they had to navigate through things like racism and prejudice and, sexism and that kind of thing. So that can add a layer of complication for sure. But ultimately, there wasn't the layer of complications that we have with a globalized community with the kind of technology we have, which was something that we went over in the last episode.
Yeah, I was speaking specifically to my grandparents, not people in general.
Yeah, of course. And so I think they were raised, and because of who they were and sort of the context they were in, it was much simpler. But I think another component on top of that is that, over time, we just collect enough experiences that help us determine whether or not, like, what are the things that we have to sweat. How many times have you and I just absolutely lost our minds about money, right? Like, oh God, we do not have enough money to pay our employees this week, right? Like, how many times has that happened over the course of 8 years, right? I think, officially, let's pretend that this started officially when we had our first employee, which Cheris was our first employee, and that was back in 2015, 2000?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So for the last 3 to 4 years, how many times have we been like, oh, great, we can't pay our employees this week, right? And how many times have we not paid our employees?
Not once.
Never, right? Never. So we've panicked, but it hasn't played out. So at this point, when we're like, we don't, oh God, we're not going to have the money this month to pay our employees, you and I just do not sweat the small stuff anymore. I mean, and that's not a small thing. Paying your employees is very important when you have a business.
Well, we get to work. We just don't have as much emotion around it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. We're just like, we run around with like chickens with our heads cut off. We just go, okay, well, we got to make sure that we get them. We got to make some rain, right? And so I think when you get older, there have been so many times when you've sweated a situation and gone, oh God, oh God, oh God. And then it just, either the worst case happened and it wasn't as bad as you thought it was going to be, or you solved it and you were able to, figure out, oh, I'm capable of that solution and it's going to be fine. And so you just have enough experiences under your belt that teach you that you've got what it takes to know when to panic and when not to panic.
I have a hypothesis. It's an intuitive hypothesis. I want to seed it out here. I don't know if we have the time to unpack it. By the way, did I just cut you off? Were you finished?
I'm finished.
Sometimes I don't know if you have a second point you're going to make, and then I'm like, did I just cut off? Like, I don't want to interrupt if you had a flow of content you were giving.
Joel, I'm going to say something that's about to blow your mind.
All right, here we go.
Okay, I always have a second point.
That's true.
It's just whether or not I'm going to go to it.
So let me just move on then. I want to seed this idea out here. It's an intuitive thought. It's like it's an impression thought. I haven't vetted it. I haven't really thought through it, but it came to me as I asked the question of my grandparents. It seems to me, and this is something that maybe you listening could expand on in your own mind, just thinking about it and then write in and give your perspective on it. It seems to me this idea of insecurity is rooted in our sexuality. It's rooted in our attractiveness to the opposite sex or same sex if we're wired that way or whatever. There seems to be like the reason why it favors the youth and not the elderly is all their procreation, biologically has already happened by the time you're 85. You've already replicated yourself in whatever way you're going to as you get older. You've already had your children, and your children have probably had children, and maybe even great-grandchildren. So your ego is satisfied with the DNA replicating itself, and so obviously, and your sex drive is lower, and your desire to procreate, like biologically wired, is much lower as you get older because the work is done in youth. And so it makes sense that a 13-year-old who hasn't been able to procreate yet, God, hopefully, like that should not be the case, but like let's say haven't had a chance, they're looking forward to this idea of I have to be super attractive to the mate that I'm going to procreate with. I mean, this is, again, I'm looking at this very much in a biological sense. Obviously, people are wired in all sorts of ways, sexually and sexual identity and all that stuff, right? Like, I'm not suggesting that people aren't wired differently, but I think there is an undercurrent of biology that runs most of us. Even people that are wired in ways that may not be what the mainstream would be wired for. And so I think there's something in this where we're careful when we're younger because we don't want to turn off potential mates because that's our ego that's like the biggest strategy we have as humans for our ego. At least we have up till now. Maybe we have better strategies going forward socially, but biologically, like who you mate with is how you replicate your DNA strand. And so insecurity seems to be rooted in this in some way. I mean, it's survival, but the procreational element of that survival is so close to it that, again, this is a hypothesis. I'm sure I could poke a ton of my own holes in my own logic here, my own thought here, but that's just something to state to try to get some conceptual ideas out there. And I'm going to do some more thinking about it as we go forward, but that's what first came to my mind.
I think that's probably a big node for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's I mean, even if you were just to split it into, I mean, the last podcast we were talking a lot about Enneagram instincts. And if you aren't familiar with Enneagram instincts, I recommend going and checking them out. We've done podcasts on it. But the 3 Enneagram instincts of social, sexual, and self-preservation. There are 3 primary, like, focal ways of getting through life. Your survival strategies are based on them. And with social, it's like the survival strategy of the tribe and focusing on the importance of the tribe and being part of it. For sexual, it's the one-to-one connections. It's the intimacy and bonds you create with another person are a big piece of your survival strategy. And for self-preservation, it's like more of a direct, okay, what is going to make sure that I and the people who are close to me survive? Like, what do I have to do? Do I have to make sure that I've got enough food and shelter and resource and we're all healthy and we're paying attention to our health and we can fight off predators and that sort of thing? And so I would say that anything that has to do with one of those 3 things is a component. In the last podcast, we talked about the 2 kinds of insecurity, which is that the first one is that am I being physically threatened or am I unprotected in some way? That would be a closer link to how self-preservation people see insecurity. Like, am I unprotected? Am I making sure that I have everything that I need and the people I love need in order to feel like we have, what we need to be able to survive physically? And then the concept of, am I good enough? Am I going to be able to find my place in society? Am I going to be able to offer something? That would be more closely linked probably to the social social instinct variant, I think, because you want to know that you have something to contribute and to offer that the collective is going to see as valuable, and so therefore will keep you inside, like insulated inside. But I think that third piece is huge too, that sexual piece. Do I have the capacity to find a viable mate and a one-to-one partner and to build intimacy and procreate with them and, continue my progeny line? And regardless of whether or not one of these is your dominant and another one is your repressed, all 3 of them live very strongly inside of us.
Yeah, it almost feels to me like it's tied to legacy also. Like, in some way, procreation means legacy. And legacy is something I think I can identify legacy, not just legacy of like my children, having children, but legacy of the children I create, like this podcast, or the content I create, the art I create in the world. There's a legacy to those children, metaphorically speaking, into the future, that if I think those legacies are threatened, I feel insecure. Or if I feel like I can't do something to secure that legacy, even if it's not my physical children, it's created children, I feel insecure about, oh no, like the podcast isn't recorded in a format that's going to be listenable in 50 years. So my legacy's threatened. That child is threatened now. I feel insecure about my recording abilities and all the technical aspects of the recording, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Narrative, right? That comes up for me. So thanks for indulging that question. I just like that came to me.
Well, and I would, that's that concept that you die 2 deaths. You die your physical death, and then you die a second death the last time somebody uses your name in reference to you. And so that concept of the legacy, I think, is part of us, our egos wanting us to continue on long after our first death. Our egos would love our second death to happen, like, maybe never if possible. But I think on top of that is this idea that, because we talk about it in survival terms a lot, because we like the concept of, evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology and concepts like that. And so we talk a lot about sort of what is underneath the surface controlling us in unconscious ways based on our evolutionary wiring. But I think another piece of it is just that our egos hitch a ride whenever they can. We are driven to procreate, for sure. Like, we want to pass on our genes and our genetic offspring, but not everybody has children, and we're having children less and less. Like, fewer people are having children and wanting to have our egos hitch a ride with our physical, like sort of our genetic offspring. But I think that's probably why we're also increasing a time period of wanting to leave our mark in the world, make our mark, have a name, because we're having fewer children. So we're probably having more of that kind of second legacy concept, or that, like, trying to forestall the second death in sort of a name sort of way.
But it's hard to solve the biology's desire for that with something that's social. And I'm not saying that can't be done. I'm just saying I think it creates an insecurity in our biology to go like deep down in the wiring of us. And again, everybody's wired differently. I'm just talking from what I can see from my perspective. which I have all sorts of privileges and perspectives and my own limitations. So this is from my perspective, but I look at this and I go, I bet you there's an insecurity in people like that does come up when we don't do the biological imperative to procreate, because I think that is in a lot of us as physical animal creatures. I think mammals are designed to replicate themselves. That's part of what drives them forward. If we don't fulfill that biologically, I do think it creates a schism, a insecurity in us that we try to make up for socially or through those other quote unquote children we create, a legacy structure. And I think it's a root insecurity that is probably not obvious to us, but I bet if we examined it, we would see more there than we realize. Even people that have made the decision not to have children going forward, or maybe they're unable to or whatever, but I bet you there is the opportunity. Let me put it this way. There's the opportunity for insecurities to present themselves there. I'm not saying everybody's going to feel insecure about that, because everybody's got their own story, their own experience. But I bet you there's a very big opening for insecurity in that framework for people, because it doesn't just speak to our survival, it speaks to our legacy.
Yeah.
Going forward.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that, because that's what's so fascinating about humans, is that we can talk about ourselves as a collective and then we talk about ourselves as individuals. And there's always going to be an exception to the rule when it comes to an individual. Like literally for every single thing you can say about humans, except for the need to eat, breathe, sleep, have biological functions. But anything that goes beyond the biological function, there's always going to be an exception to the rule for a human. But that doesn't mean that that's not a rule. It's an exception that proves the rule. It's like one person amongst 7 billion or whatever, like a small collective of people amongst 7 billion that end up being sort of the anomalies. But the overwhelming majority of people do feel these pulls. And I do think that there are people who just legit have zero interest in children and there's no insecurity about it. And they just do not have that need at all in them. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're feeling more and more of it because, sort of we tend to, on a sort of a collective unconscious level, overcorrect for some of the problems that we're experiencing. And one of the problems we're experiencing in humanity is overpopulation. So it seems that overpopulation is course correcting in some way by making fewer and fewer people want to have children or live a lifestyle that children they're just not a part of the equation. But that doesn't mean, just because we're overcorrecting potentially, that's one of my intuitive leaps because I have no evidence for that whatsoever other than just sheer bullshit observation. But that concept of overcorrecting for overpopulation, or correcting for overpopulation rather, doesn't mean that we still don't have a biological imperative to continue on. And so there could be insecurity around that, even if the person has decided to not go that direction. It's not going to show up so much in whether or not they're having children. It's going to show up in mate selection, right? Because you still, even if you're not going to have kids, you still want the best mate you can get. And it's going to show up in insecurities around whether or not you're attractive to other people and whether or not those people are desirous of wanting to be with you, the people that you're attracted to. So sexual insecurity shows up in a lot of different ways, regardless of whether or not a child ever becomes the product of any of those relationships going down the line. There's still that insecurity inside of us, or opportunity to feel insecure if we don't believe that we are attracting the people that we want to attract.
I think it's really well put. So you brought in some of the Enneagram typology, which we weren't intending to do, but I think it's really good, especially in the light of what we just talked about. We talked about the instincts, social, sexual, or self-preservation instincts that show up. For example, I'm an Enneagram 6 social. So I have certain aspects of my personality that come out that, direct me in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. But let's shift over to the Myers-Briggs system and talk about personality types and how insecurity might come up for different types of personalities. Now, we probably don't have the space to talk about all 16, so what we'll do is we'll consolidate down to what's called cognitive functions. If you're new, head over to Personality Hacker. If this is your first episode you've ever heard, we're talking about something called cognitive functions. These are the ways our mind is learning information or making decisions. It's like the basic way to explain it in layman's terms. But there's a ton of information on Personality Hacker around this. If you just search cognitive functions, you can also do a general Google search. But obviously, we think we describe it pretty good. We've done several podcasts and written articles on this. So there's tons of information on that. And we'll try to do our best to weave together access points for you if you are a new listener and you don't have that reference under your belt.
When we don't have time to talk about all 16 types, what we do is we do a cheat, which is that we talk about the cognitive functions and the mental processes that go into each of these types. And then we let you do the work of figuring out how these functions are manifesting in your life and in your personality type, because you're the best person at determining how this is working for you.
And we use something called the CAR model to frame it. So you can also look up CAR model on Personality Hacker to get a framework for how we lay these out, basically.
Right, which I'll be using in just a moment here, because I think that before you talk about specific types, I think it's good to get sort of a foundational concept, a couple of foundational concepts under your belt. The first one being that the further down a function is in our stack, or what we call like the younger the function is in the CAR model, the more insecure we are in general with it. We like take, for example, our inferior function, or the 3-year-old in the CAR model. That's the place of some of our deepest insecurities, because we have the least amount of confidence in ourselves around them. We know we're not using them that often. We know that we don't really they're not our go-to place, and so we end up not taking in as much territory. It's usually a very simple, particularly our 3-year-old or inferior function, we kind of want to get out of it as fast as possible, unless we're using it in a way that does not tax us at all. We usually are trying to sort of race back to our dominant cognitive function or our driver function, because that's where we feel the best. So a lot of times our insecurities are sparked. They don't necessarily live in, but sometimes they can live in those functions. But they're definitely sparked by them. And anytime the world requires us to show that aspect of ourselves, we get to a place where we feel very self-conscious. We feel very self-conscious when the world requires us to perform in our tertiary inferior, or what we call the 10-year-old and 3-year-old functions. So the further down you go in your CAR model, just remember that those are probably the places that your insecurities are going to manifest the most. The higher up in the stack, the more confidence you have, the more you have tested your mettle in using them in a variety of situations and circumstances. If you are deeply insecure, you might use your dominant and auxiliary, or your driver and co-pilot. You might use them in a way that overcompensates for your insecurities, because they're your go-to tools in the toolbox. But the insecurity doesn't often live there. It's usually sparked by something further down in the stack. So I think that's one good thing to kind of remember about how our relationship with our functions. And the second thing is that our judging functions, or those decision-making functions, which are either thinking or feeling, introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, and extroverted feeling, those are where all of our evaluations live. Those are our should statements about life. So oftentimes our insecurities are very much informed by our judging functions, because our judging functions are what are telling us how life should be. And not just life, but us as individuals. Like, we should be a certain way. We should be a certain way in relationship to everybody else. This is how life should be. And so our judging functions are very, very influential in our insecurities. Whereas our perceiving functions, or our learning functions, are more likely to focus our attention towards certain things. So like, I use introverted thinking as a TP, but I'm combining it with extroverted intuition. So I'm going to most likely have insecurities manifest, or I'm going to compensate for my insecurities using introverted thinking. But my insecurities are probably going to be informed by the things that my extroverted intuition is focused on, versus maybe an STP that is combining their introverted thinking with a function called extroverted sensing. So we both might show up very similar in our insecurities as TPs, but the kinds of things that we're insecure about are going to be different based more on what our perceiving function or our learning function is telling us is important to focus on.
I have a real quick comment about this, because I think you're right. And so your father is an ESTP, and you, Antonia, are an ENTP. So both of you are using that judging function of introverted thinking as your co-pilot in the CAR model, or auxiliary, and your dominant or driver function is different. Yours is extroverted intuition, his is extroverted sensing. And I've noticed that he's older now, and he had a stroke recently, and he was visiting us a couple years ago, and he fell. And he was very insecure about something that he used to pride himself around, being very physical. He used to be a professional roller skater. He had a lot of command over his physical body, but because his body's been breaking down, all of a sudden he's worried, and he's very insecure about how he's showing up and the abilities he has engaging with the outer world. Whereas I think your insecurities are more mimetic. They're usually typically like things you worry in, like mimetic challenges or more abstract intuitive challenges would be maybe where your insecurities come up. So that's just a quick example of maybe where those two things split, how you're approaching things. There's insecurity there, but it's also to speak to that, it's actually the thing he was really good at that he's now insecure about because he lost it. So it's not in his back seat or it's not in his lower in his stack. It's something it's primary, but he's lost the ability for it, which created an insecurity in him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's the other thing is that insecurity is very complex and complicated, and there are so many different nodes in a system that will feed into it. So obviously, there's a lot of patterns here that can be called, but I think that that's not a bad way to point it out. Whereas I would say that introverted intuition, which is his 3-year-old or inferior function, he actually does have a lot of mimetic insecurity, but he's very good at pushing it away. Like he doesn't really want to think too hard about whether or not he agrees with his religious perspective, because he decided a long time ago that he was going to go with this religion, do or die, right? And so I do think that he actually has mimetic insecurities around his religious beliefs and his convictions around that, which I use the word conviction loosely. It's more of sort of an alignment. But I do think he has insecurity about that, but he pushes it away and doesn't really think about it much. Whereas with me, I would agree that my insecurities are a lot more, they're going to be about how people perceive me on a more intellectual level. Like my dad doesn't worry about whether or not people think he's smart. He knows he's smart and he doesn't care about other people not thinking he's smart. Whereas I would say that at this stage of the game, I'm less insecure about it, but that was I was preoccupied with that for a very long time. It's one of the reasons why I talk the way that I do. I talk the way that I do because it is now natural, but it was an affectation when I was earlier. I intentionally deepened my voice and flattened it because I wanted people to take me seriously. And so now it's just how I talk, but it's from decades of affectation because I was worried that people wouldn't think I was smart enough. So now I wanted to sound smart. Whereas when it comes to the insecurities that I have in my 3-year-old or inferior, which is sensing, right? Introverted sensing, I have a ton of insecurities about how I take care of my body. And I also have a ton of indecision and insecurity there about whether or not I'm capable of making the decisions I need to make in order to honor my body. I go down the nutrition sort of black hole, the internet black hole of nutritional information, and I find nothing but conflicting information everywhere, right? Like I think I'm on the right path with a really good diet that's going to work really well for me, and somebody who I think is credible will go, oh, you shouldn't be doing that because blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, oh, great. So then I do whatever they tell me to be doing. And I do that for a while. And I'm like, okay, this is the thing that's going to really take care of my body. And then I run into another person who I think is credible. And they're like, oh, no, you shouldn't be doing that at all because blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, oh, God. So I have nothing but insecurity in my introverted sensing because I don't know if I'm actually, is the temple being taken care of? I don't know. I'm just throwing things in it that I think are good for it. I have no idea. So my insecurities around being considered smart melted away very quickly as I aged and went, you know what? I don't really care about that. But it was what I focused on because of my extroverted intuition driver dominant. But as I aged, I thought about that less and less. But I still, at the age of 41, I'll be 42 this year, at the age of 41, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do to be a healthy person. So I'm just basically just spitballing here. Like I think I'm supposed to be eating protein. I'm pretty sure veggies are good for you. I'm doing lots of leafy greens. Am I supposed to be eating really good, high quality, good seed bread? I don't know. I am going to, but there's a bunch of people who tell me that maybe I shouldn't be eating any gluten. But then those people don't necessarily know. And am I supposed to be off dairy? I'm pretty sure I am. But then I read all this stuff about how I shouldn't be too far away from iodine, which is found in milk products, and the iodine isn't found in almond milk. And
I get it.
Okay, sorry. All right. Sorry, I bored everybody there.
No,
but
no, I totally understand. It's just which expert do you follow? Which one do you trust? And it's all conflicting. I get
in this whirlwind of it, and it's horrible. So anyway, not to go harp on and on about my personal insecurities, but that's generally how it works. The higher up it is in your stack, the more preoccupied you are with whether or not that thing is, people are seeing you the way that you want to be seen. But the further down in your stack, it's legit lack of self-confidence. That is where the legit lack of self-confidence lives, and you don't know whether or not you have a good handle on that. So those are the two principles to remember. I know I went on about me, so I'll remind everybody of those two principles. The first one being that The further down in the stack, the more likely you are to feel insecure about it on a long-range timeline. And the second thing is that our judging functions have a tendency to inform our insecurities more because they're the shoulds of the world. They're the way that we think we should be showing up and the way that the world should be, responding to us.
I think those are great frameworks. I also think that when we have competency around something, to add a third point, like your dad, for example, and it goes away, I think that creates insecurity for us too in our type. So we were really good at something, and then all of a sudden we're not good at that. I bet SE, extroverted sensing people, like ESTPs, ESFPs, I bet they deal with this maybe the most of anyone, because as we age, our physicality is taken from us, as just by natural breakdown of the body. That's going to be very destabilizing. Something you probably felt like you had a command of is atrophying over time, and that could be really frustrating and feeling like, man, I don't know who I am without this in a lot of ways. I think maybe one of the launching points for getting into the specifics of type is how surprising it is when I'm not insecure about something that's another personality type is insecure about. Or when I'm insecure about something and they're like, I can't resonate with that at all. I'm like, how are you not insecure about this? This feels so real and visceral to me. I mean, one of the things, like, I am baffled by a lot of thinkers, in particular NT thinkers, so intuitive thinkers in the Myers-Briggs system, go on about IQ tests and their intelligence levels. And that's not always bragging. Sometimes it's just like good conversation. Like oh yeah, I took an IQ test this time and like I had this IQ, or some people won't tell their IQ because they want to keep it private, because then it's like a pissing contest or something around who has the better IQ. And that's you, right, Antonia? You don't like to say it because you don't want to get in battles around it or whatever.
I hate talking about IQs. But that's because I was raised, to be fair, I was raised in a family that couldn't stop talking about my brother's IQ. So yeah,
but that's like because he's an NT, right? So it's just my point proven. So I look at this and I never worry about people thinking I'm stupid, to the point where I will literally make people think I'm stupid on purpose for some other end or some other reason that frustrates you to death.
Oh, that's horrifying.
Like we'll be out somewhere and I'll actually play the fool and look dumb, and you're like, dude, you can't do this. I'm your partner, and you make me look stupid if you look stupid. And I'm like, really? You're insecure about that? Like, I'm the one doing it. I don't care if this person thinks I'm stupid. I know I'm not, so why would I worry about that? I have zero insecurity about people thinking I'm dumb or stupid. Now, it's different on the podcast. I do have a little bit more insecurity about it because I'm a feeler, and sometimes I know we've got a lot of NTs in our audience. I've even told some of our profiler training NTs, like some INTP friends of mine, I'm like, sometimes I talk and I feel like all the NTs are judging me and how dumb I sound when I'm trying to articulate something, but it's more emotional or more introverted feeling or something, right? My ENFP nature. So I have some insecurity there depending on the audience, but often I very rarely care at all about my intelligence levels. I've never taken an IQ test. I could care less what it was. It means nothing to me. But I know it means a lot to other people, and they have insecurities around their intelligence levels. These comments online, like, a lot of trolling online from people in the type communities, like trying to fight and stuff. And I'm like, why are you doing this? It feels like you're trying to prove your intelligence. Just own that you're smart. Why do you do this? So from my standpoint, a jumping off point is just to see the differences in how types just are almost blind to the insecurity of other types. I certainly am. I'm sure you have blindnesses on your side. And I'm sure, TJs and FJs have the same blindness for whatever they're insecure about and not insecure about. Like, I think we all have this. So maybe that's a good place to look in comparing and contrasting together.
Yeah. And I think we can do a little bit of spitballing here too, because I was going through what are some of the insecurities that other types have that I just don't understand. And actually the first thing that jumped out at me is that anybody who has introverted intuition or extroverted sensing is a polarity, perceiving function polarity. So these would be all the NJs and the SPs. There's an amount of physical insecurity that they have, and not that they're necessarily insecure, like they feel perpetually unsafe, but it's something that's on their radar way more than it is on my radar. I don't think about physical safety very often at all, as in like who's going to come get me and whether or not I can handle myself and whether or not I'm going to fall as I'm jumping over this, like on the trail or whatever. I've noticed that people who have extroverted sensing in their stack can carry on a conversation about fighting and war tactics and whether or not like we're safe as a society. Like they can usually do that for much longer than I can, or they feel physically threatened more often. If they're in we recently had a situation where I was around an ISFP who was in a conflict, and the first thing that she was worried about was whether or not that person was going to take themselves out, right? Or they were going to take her out. And I was like, that seemed like a really huge leap to me, but I could appreciate that as somebody who uses extroverted sensing. There's like this sense of vigilance that anybody who has that in their stack.
It's immediate and physical and right now.
Yeah, exactly. It's like an immediate vigilance. Whereas I think that anybody who has extroverted intuition or introverted sensing, right, no matter where that falls in their stack, so NPs and SJs have a sense of like more of a security perspective. It's more about whether or not they feel secure over a longer distance, whether or not they feel rooted or grounded, or like do they have a home base to come back to? And they can have conversations last a little bit longer about how they're going to settle down or the kinds of things that they want to settle down around. So I think what ends up happening is that the insecurity that comes up for people who have extroverted sensing is it's more likely to be whether or not they're managing their environment to ensure that nobody could sneak up on them, to ensure that they could see, like that they can have that level of vigilance just to be able to sort of rest into and allow their introverted intuition to open up, right? So that they can be more imaginative and live in that space. Whereas with people who use extroverted intuition or introverted sensing, it's more about what is trapping them and whether or not they're willing to be in that situation. Like if you're an SJ and you've got introverted sensing at the top of your stack or as a driver, you're going to be a lot more likely to want to be very rooted, and then you're going to feel insecure about anything that inflicts quick change on you. So it's more about like what level of groundedness do you need in order to be able to accept big and quick change?
Quick, decontextualized change.
Yeah, disruptive change.
Because like getting married's a big change, but there's a big ceremony and context to it, and a lot of ISJs are totally cool with that. It's a disruptive moment in your life, but it's contextually appropriate, so that big change is okay. It's not like it just happened out of nowhere.
Well, and arguably you had a bunch of relationship building that led up to it.
Correct.
And everybody got used to this. Like everybody, all your family members met each other, and like everybody had time to acclimate to this idea. And then it's one big change that sets your life on a specific trajectory, ostensibly from that moment forward. So it's a big disruptive change, but like you said, it's got a lot of like sort of rites of passage around it.
Yeah.
Whereas, and so I think a lot of times the insecurities, now that I think about it, the insecurities come from it actually usually comes from external things. Extroverted sensing, the insecurities would come from whether or not I'm safe in my environment. And extroverted intuition is whether or not I can handle the change coming at me, and something that might be very disruptive to the stability of my life. Whereas I think in our introverted functions, particularly the introverted perceiving functions, there's less insecurity that lives in there, right? It's internal. You don't really have to be all that vigilant about it. It's happening inside of you, and it's not really a judging function. It's more just what you happen to be looking at. So I think that the functions that are probably the least insecure in and of themselves without any meddling are probably the introverted perceiving functions.
Okay. I'm going to push back on that a little bit because I know
yeah.
a lot of people, a lot of SPs in the Myers-Briggs system that have extroverted sensing, and they struggle with paranoia and worry and anxiety because that backseat of that introverted intuition, either at the 10-year-old tertiary or the inferior 3-year-old position. And I've been around some of these people also when they've been on like substance like cannabis, for example, which also seems to activate their intuitive process. It puts them in a paranoid state. Oh God, I don't know what's going to happen. And so I've noticed that showing up for people that are extroverted sensing users.
You're totally right. And that was a very good pushback because what I had just said was something that came up in my extroverted intuition, but that pushback is absolutely accurate.
Well, I think you applied it to introverted judging functions at first. So introverted thinking and introverted feeling. I could be wrong, but my mind applied it to that. And then you said the perceiving functions. So either way, I would actually argue what you said does hold true to some degree for introverted feeling, introverted thinking.
So, okay, so as we're playing this out. Because it is very
subjective and down inside of me.
Yeah,
I know all the parts of it.
I'm glad we're having this conversation because I think we're kind of sort of filleting this out a little bit. Because how do you apply insecurity to the functions? And I had a bunch of ideas coming in, but I think as we're talking, a bunch of stuff is sort of falling into place for me a little bit more. So you, the listener, will have to forgive as we do a little bit of idea generation right in front of you. So I think you're accurate. Again, these are the functions, the SPs that have insecurity in their introverted intuition around paranoia, especially if they're using, psychotropics or mind-altering substances. Definitely, there's a ton of insecurity in the introverted intuition, particularly when it's low in the stack, because that's the place of less, like you take in less territory, and also you have a lot less confidence in your ability to use it. I've actually experienced an extremely insecure introverted sensing moment myself as somebody who uses it as my three-year-old or inferior function. And this was when I had a mind-altering substance, and I started thinking things in a very insecure way. I started wondering if I'm allowed to have the business that I have. Like, am I actually contributing to society anyway? Am I enough of a contributing member of society? Is what I'm doing, podcasting and writing books and creating digital products, is that actually something that I'm just saying is of value, or is it actually a value to the world? And I had to calm my introverted sensing function down by promising that I was going to get to work. Like, I was going to be more, I wasn't going to be as lackadaisical. I promised it that I would be a hard worker. And so I would do everything I could to put value in the world by working hard, which is interesting because that was the paranoia my introverted sensing was getting to, which is that I wasn't working hard enough and I was not contributing enough, which is very fascinating. So you are absolutely accurate. I wonder if there is a sense from the external functions, the external perceiving functions in particular, that the insecurity comes from a sense of being like maybe even physically threatened, or maybe not physically threatened, but having your life threatened. It's more of like that style of insecurity we talked about in the previous podcast about whether or not you're prepared for your environment, or the insecurity of like you might not be be protected. Whereas the introverted perceiving functions would be more about a sense of questioning whether or not your perceptions on being protected against physical things are accurate, whether or not you are, like, your impression of whether or not you're being threatened might actually be off. And so the insecurity from within is that I have a bad read on this. I actually am being threatened.
Yeah, so this podcast is turning into really cool freeform conversation. I'm going to reintroduce another model we've talked about, because I also think this might have some gold to be slicing in this way as well. I'm going to bring in the firm model. We've used this in the past, FIRM, firm. Look up the podcast on it because we don't have time to go into all the details if you're a new listener. But the firm model basically breaks all 16 Myers-Briggs types into 4 quadrants. So it talks about EPs, IJs, IPs, and EJs in the Myers-Briggs system. And it basically follows, and I didn't do that in order, I don't think.
No, you did.
Did I do that in order?
Yeah.
Okay, good. F stands for freedom, and we have identified there's a fixation of freedom for all EPs. The I stands for invulnerability. There's a fixation of wanting to be invulnerable for all IJs. The R stands for rightness. There seems to be a fixation for all IPs to want to be right. And there's a fixation on management or control. All EJs seem to share. So we've kind of looked at type through these lenses or these slices. And as we're talking, I'm realizing that I bet you, like, I have an insecurity of not being free. I'm realizing my firm fixation plays into this so much that I was like, as you were talking, I'm trying to like run through every type I know and people I know in my life. And I'm realizing if we zoomed in on the firm fixations first, we could probably talk about each cognitive function or slice, but I'm looking at the polarity. There's so much fidelity to this, depending on where it is and the person's age. Like your father, his whole life has never been insecure about his physicality until he's like 83 or whatever, or I'm sorry, 73 or 74.
He's almost 80.
Or he's almost 80, whatever, in the last 5 years. He basically now has some insecurity around his physicality because of his age, but he's never had that up till now. So it's not the function, it's the age he is using that function in his life.
And he's losing freedom.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's more the principle level. So we could probably go into all the specifics, but I bet you we'll get caught up in the weeds of trying to force things onto certain functions or polarities that aren't necessarily there just to make it work. I'm watching the firm model pop up in my mind going, I bet you there's more insecurities that we can identify there and really work through to give you listening something practical to take away from this show.
You're totally right. And I think I was about to get into the weeds hardcore because as I'm thinking about this and flaying this out, I'm like, we could be doing a whole day workshop on this.
Yeah, or
There's
multiple
so much.
podcasts, just on and on and on.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to be said here. Absolutely, about insecurity and how it manifests in type. Oh my gosh, you're right. So I agree with you. I think we should stick with the firm model. I think that's a fantastic way of looking at it.
And then anecdotally, other type stuff could pop out of that. But.
Yeah. Well, and I also do think that there is a little bit to, like this concept that IJs lead with the introverted perceiving functions. They always lead with introverted intuition or introverted sensing. And their firm fixation is in invulnerability. And it's because they feel quite vulnerable to the outside world, because anything that comes at them fast is something that they're afraid they won't have the reaction time to be able to respond to well. And so there's this sense of not wanting to be vulnerable to the outside world, particularly also because once you have an experience, your introverted perceiving function of introverted intuition or introverted sensing must post-process it. So that it must be absorbed and then soaked in and then later on processed. So there's this fear that no matter what happens in the outside world, it's going to be slurped inside and then get stuck there, especially if you don't do the work of post-processing, which might be very unpleasant if the situation was unpleasant. So I bet there's a lot of insecurity around this concept of being vulnerable to the outside world. In particular, because your inferior function or 3-year-old function is those extroverted perceiving functions, those ones that require you to move fast. If you're an INJ, that's extroverted sensing. Extroverted sensing is the function of quick responsive time, response time to what is going on in the immediate surroundings. And the further down it falls in your stack, it's not to say that you cannot be a quick responder or even a first responder. It's to say that you're going to have more doubts about your ability to do so. And so you're going to have more insecurity, more like you're probably going to hold yourself back a little bit, wondering if you're the right person to do it, and did I see the full situation, and so you're just not, and you're not going to put yourself in situations that test your mettle around that. So INJs are going to have more insecurity around whether or not they can be responsive to the immediate environment well enough, whereas ISJs that have extroverted intuition as their 3-year-old or inferior are going to have more doubts around their ability to handle disruptive, massive change, because extroverted intuition is all around disruption. It's around novelty and being able to sort of deal with things that you've never seen before, things that you may have yourself invented. And so there's going to be some insecurity with ISJs around their ability to deal with massive disruption. And so that will also feed into their focus on invulnerability, creating a situation or a circumstance, or maybe even a little context or fiefdom that makes it that it's not penetrable to those disruptive changes. And so I think that's definitely a piece of it.
So then what you're identifying through that comment is that, so let's look at the firm model as the framework. So I look at freedom, the first one, all EPs, ESFP, ENTP, ESTP, and ENFPs in the Myers-Briggs system are going to be having a fixation on freedom. We really want to be unfettered and free in our lives, whether it's physical, and we wrote a whole chapter in our book about this too, so we detail out how each type would manifest it. But basically, we're all interested in freedom in a way, whether it's physical, maybe for the extroverted sensing people, or mimetic for the extroverted intuitive people. All EPs are fixated on this, but what I seem to hear you suggesting in the last comment is it's actually the 3-year-old or inferior process that's informing the insecurity part of it. It's not like I'm insecure about my extroverted intuition, wanting freedom. It plays really well in the realm of freedom. It's worrying that my introverted sensing 3-year-old, that inferior part of me, isn't able to create the systems or the structure. And in fact, as I'm talking, I know this is actually true because I can feel it inside myself. Do I have what it takes to build the structure to support the freedom I want in the outer world or in my life? And so all of my anxieties and insecurities in our business, I'm realizing, come down to me going, but if we don't name this file correctly on the website here and this tagging structure for customers, people are going to be mad, and that jeopardizes the platform, which allows me to get on a podcast and have the freedom to create and be expressive. So I have to, so I have all this insecurity around all this introverted sensing detail on the back end of our company, right? Not knowing how to handle it and being stressed out about paperwork and all these extra little, crossing my T's, dotting my I's and all that. So is that, I just want to confirm that's what you're suggesting then?
Yeah.
That kind of backseat part.
Yeah, effectively, because you insinuated, you full out said it, that you have, in order to have the freedom you crave, full unfettered freedom is an ideal that doesn't exist in the outside world. It just doesn't exist. And so in order to create the amount of freedom that you want, the true freedom you want, you're going to have some groundedness and rootedness, right? Like it's the blank page syndrome.
It's always built off of a platform of something.
Exactly. Some sort of infrastructure helps create it. And so because of that, it's actually the insecurity of the introverted sensing, knowing what to align itself with, what wagon am I going to hitch myself to? What infrastructure am I going to be playing into? And it's also the insecurity of being able to stick with it. I think that's a big piece of it. I think for ESPs, there's the sense that, there's a desire to have a lot of playful freedom. ESPs are very playful creatures. And so they want to do a lot of play, but the implications of their play is there's oftentimes a lot of question marks around that. Their introverted intuition knows that there's going to be implications to everything that they do. There's meaning behind everything that they do. And the big question, though, is whether or not they're doing the right things that have the right meaning to them. Just like we as ENPs are wondering if we're aligning ourselves to the right wagon, so to speak. Their question is actually more sort of existential. Are they aligning themselves to the right meaning in their life? And are they making the decisions that will allow them to, like, the long-term consequences of their life? Are those the right decisions that they want to be making? And because we all have to stick ourselves to something. Even
articulating that, though, is more sophisticated than I think SPs might be experiencing it on their side. That's why the insecurities there is they couldn't even articulate the way you just did potentially, and that's why that insecurity lives there, right?
Yeah, well, and I think that as ENPs, we can't really articulate it that well either. We just know that, it's like, well, I kind of want to get a tattoo, but I just haven't decided on one because I'm going to have it forever, so I can't really get a tattoo because I don't know which one I want, right? And this is like in perpetuity. So we don't really see that about ourselves, but the insecurity is manifesting in our inferior 3-year-old function because we just don't know if the decisions we're making are the right ones. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot of insecurity that lives in that, both for freedom types, the EPs, and also on the flip side, the I types, the invulnerability types.
So invulnerability leading with introverted sensing for the ISJs in the Myers-Briggs system, or introverted intuition, the INJs in the Myers-Briggs system. In the back, you're going to have, like you already articulated, extroverted sensing in that 3-year-old position, inferior position, or extroverted intuition in that 3-year-old or inferior position. And in that, it's like that vigilance, that extroverted sensing vigilance for the NJ types, the INJs. And then for the ISJ types, it's that ability to adapt to new disruptive things. Mm-hmm. So if you're kind of following, I'm kind of going back and re-articulating that so you can follow along the firm. FIR, we haven't talked about it all yet, the Rightness framework.
Yeah, so, I just totally went out of order, and I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm reorientating us, which is cool. I'm SIing for a moment, getting us on a nice timeline and organized. So in the Rightness, we have the IP types, ISTPs, INTPs, ISFPs, and INFPs in the Myers-Briggs system.
Yeah.
And there's a fixation on being, you're leading with a function, either introverted thinking or introverted feeling. These are subjective, internal, judging functions. So you're evaluating criteria and you're making determination based on if you're introverted thinking, what makes logical sense to you, and if you're introverted feeling, what resonates or is authentic to you as the person. So it's extremely subjective, maybe even the most subjective of all those fixations.
Yeah.
Going forward. And the back seat, so let's look at this. It would be extroverted feeling or extroverted thinking in the back seat. So how do we see these insecurities coming up typically for the Rightness fixation in the firm model?
Well, for introverted thinking, for the ITPs, I don't think there's a lot of insecurity for ITPs around their ability to analyze and see logic. There's not a lot of insecurity there. For the IFPs, there's not a lot of insecurity about their ability to go inside and suss out their own motivations and intent as a general rule. But there's a ton of insecurity around helping the outside world understand those processes and the conclusions you've come to. So as an ITP, having extroverted feeling as your 3-year-old or inferior function means that your gift is to articulate logic and analysis and data points and rationale and information that other people may not want to hear because it's going to burst their bubble. We just did that whole podcast a few podcasts ago on why the world needs introverted thinking. And hopefully we'll do one on why the world needs introverted feelings soon, so we can talk a little bit about the magic of that as well. But the big problem or challenge here is that not everybody wants to hear what introverted thinking has to say. And so it cuts connection. Like, is the thing that seems so obvious to me, if I articulate it to the outside world, are other people going to want to stop being around me?
I've also noticed that introverted thinking tends to, using that extroverted feeling in the back seat, doesn't know how to articulate its own competency levels. So it's trying to communicate to the outside world, look, I have information and competency around this thing. Like, I know what I'm talking about. But because that extroverted judging function is their 3-year-old or inferior, they're not calibrated. There's some insecurity on knowing how to communicate that. And so what I've noticed is the insecurity is covered by maybe overdoing it. Bragging could be one of the ways that extroverted feeling in the backseat does this.
Yeah. I don't know if you did we start out by talking about bragging for TPs at
No.
all? Okay. So
I don't think so, maybe, but just say what you got to say about it anyway. If we did it, you'll hear it again.
Yeah, you're here to get. Yeah. And that is one of the biggest challenges that TPs have is exactly what level of braggy McBraggerton are you allowed to get away with without people just rolling their eyes. But the insecurity isn't in the introverted thinking usually. Usually introverted thinking feels quite secure around it. It's whether or not, like you said, other people acknowledge your credibility around this thing. And there's also the insecurity that people don't like you because you don't know how to connect with them very well. And so the bragging comes up oftentimes because you want people to like you, and you've noticed that people like people who are competent, and so you're going to talk about how competent you are, not realizing a lot of TPs eventually realize, hopefully, fingers crossed, they eventually realize that sort of, what is that called? Self, like it's a value signaling. That's what they call it, value signaling or something to that effect, where you're constantly like sort of telling people what your value is. And it's basically, it's like another word for bragging.
Well, they just, I think healthily, they shift from explaining it to demonstrating it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's what they basically are doing. Instead of explaining it away, just demonstrate it and people will know you're competent.
Yeah, but the insecurity falls in whether or not people like you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so so that would be the ITPs. And then the IFPs, their insecurity is in their way to, sort of demonstrate their value through their ability to manage resource or time or whatever, like their production. And so the insecurity isn't in their introverted feeling or what they have conviction around. It's more in their ability to articulate, put words and definitions around these things, and then articulate and demonstrate their value to other people based on the fact that they feel things so strongly and other people might not care about that. Yeah. And so the extroverted thinking is the place where most of the insecurities live. It's like, why do I have to produce things in order to be valuable as a human being? And it's like, well, because all of us do on some level. So I think, and so that desire to be right is actually a frustration of not being able to articulate what seems so obvious to you as what is right. Like these things feel very, very obvious. And by the way, on a little bit more of a sophisticated dance level, IPs are experiencing the same insecurities of the EPs. Like that whole concept of that freedom piece and the insecurity of the dance between that driver and that 3-year-old, or like the extroverted intuition, introverted sensing for NPs, or the extroverted sensing, introverted intuition for the SPs. There's a little bit of that insecurity that plays into them as well. And vice versa. There's going to be some of the insecurities that IPs feel around rightness that all EPs are going to be manifesting. It's just going to be a little bit more of a sophisticated dance because the functions are not as spread so far apart. And you have a little bit more of a conscious relationship with your co-pilot and your 10-year-old. So those functions are going to do a better job of sort of shining it on. But we're going to feel a lot of insecurity around that too. Like take, for example, I'm going to feel quite a bit of insecurity in my extroverted feeling 10-year-old. And you, Joel, as an EFP, are going to feel insecurity in your extroverted thinking as a 10-year-old as well. But not nearly to the level of insecurity that we feel in our introverted sensing 3-year-old. And that's kind of how it works. The further down in the stack it goes, the more insecure you feel about it, the less territory you're taking in, the less confident you feel.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, by the way?
Absolutely.
All right.
Well, moving over to the M in firm, management or control. Well, management fits nicely for the acronym firm.
Well, I like the word management actually because all of these are forms of control.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? They really are fundamentally, but we consider like a controlling person to be somebody who's constantly managing everyone around them. So I think that's why we chose the word M.
And these are EJs, ENTJs, ESTJs, ENFJs, and ESFJs. And the fixation tends to want to be in control and management of their environment, whether it's their own personal environment, their family or social circle environment, or even an environment at large, like entire countries or businesses or anything like this. It tends to be EJs that enjoy the management process and managing a lot of moving parts and resource and things that are happening. And so that fixation is there. And I think the insecurity is that if like I'm embodying now an EJ, if I'm not in control, I don't know, like I need to be in charge because I don't know where I stand if I'm not. Like I need to be in control of this or managing it. I don't exactly know where I contribute if I'm not kind of at the helm for them.
Yeah, well, and also when you manage things, you get to shield all of the deep insecurities you have about your value and worth as a human being, which fundamentally live in your 3-year-old function of introverted thinking or introverted feeling. When you're managing everything, that creates a really nice little sort of sheen on just how painfully insecure you can be around your individual worth and value as a person. So like for an ETJ, their 3-year-old or inferior function is going to be introverted feeling. And that's where not just conviction lives, but also sort of how you determine value.
Am I a good person? Do I have any self-worth? Like that's pretty much what I think that question would be asking to an ETJ. Or like the introverted feeling part of them would ask that question.
Yeah, am I making decisions that are good for people and for myself? Like because extroverted thinking has a tendency to want to, if possible, create a system that's so beautiful and streamlined, you never have to think about it again, but that means we have to sort of all fit ourselves to that system. And then the question becomes, am I valuing individuals enough? Am I making ethical and moral decisions? Am I doing the right thing? Actually, that's really what it comes down to. Am I doing the right thing? And am I doing the right thing as a 3-year-old function is about as sophisticated usually as the questioning gets when it's deeply unconscious. Now, if an ETJ goes to introverted feeling consciously and thoughtfully, of course, obviously, they can flay out far more sophisticated questions than that. But when it's unconscious and the person's not really looking at it too hard and they're fixated on managing everything, it's the insistent little question, am I doing the right thing? Right? And whatever implications that means.
And maybe for extroverted feeling, it would be, am I believing the right thing? Am I thinking, are my thoughts in alignment? Am I calibrated? Am I smart? Do I have the right calibration of my thoughts for what I'm doing in the outer world?
Yeah, exactly. Or am I being honest? Right? Am I being honest with myself? Am I living my truth is probably a big thing. That's even more sophisticated than probably the question is. But it's for introverted thinking, for EFJs, it's oftentimes, am I tricking myself? Am I kidding myself? Am I not facing some truth that's important? And so the more you manage things in the outside world, though, the more you can kind of sort of kick those cans. I know I use that phrase all the time now, but I just love it so much. So I'm going to use it until I've burned it out, and then I'll stop saying kicking the can.
Which phrase?
Kicking the can down the road.
It's just an old person phrase.
I know, it's an old person phrase.
In my day, I used to kick the can around.
That's right.
I mean, that's probably where it's coming from.
Is my oldness. Yeah. My geriatric podcasting.
I don't know. I'm just kidding.
No, somebody recently said it like in the last year, and I was like, I love that phrase, and now I use it. Eventually, I'll just play it out, and I won't use it anymore. But so for somebody who's an EJ, they can kick the can of their insecurities down the road further if they can just be managing and in control, because then nobody can call them on it. So I've noticed with EFJs, when introverted thinking is their 3-year-old or inferior, because it is, there might be some deep personal truths that they are legit avoiding. Like maybe the relationship isn't that good and they don't want to think about that. Or maybe they're not that happy in the decisions they made in their life and they feel stuck, or they feel like they just kind of have to live out this life and it was not the life that they were expecting. Or maybe there's a truth that they're running away from childhood. Like maybe they've got like healing work to do and they just do not want to think about that. So if they're just managing the outside world and they're getting everybody's needs met and they're busy and they can make it all about what's going on out here, maybe they take up some social cause, or maybe it's like become about, helping others in need, and they just never, ever, ever have to go back to that little baby 3-year-old introverted thinking that has this insistent truth, this cognitive dissonance that it keeps like sort of tapping at the door about. And so that's the insecurity. The insecurity is that they're not actually listening to the insistent messages inside of themselves that says something is deeply wrong. Same thing with an ETJ. It's just that the deeply wrong thing is that you're living outside of your personal moral code.
As we're talking, I'm realizing, I'm recognizing and I want to honor that every type has insecurity. But as I'm looking at the two last letters in the firm model, the IPs and the EJs, from my perspective, it seems like it's less obvious they have insecurity. And both IPs and EJs are using they're leading their dominant primary cognitive function is a decision-making function. It's a judging function. They're not all judgers. Don't get that caught up. It's the same word to mean two things. They're using a judging function. It's either an introverted judging function or an extroverted judging function, but they're leading with a judging function. And so it appears to me, as someone that doesn't lead with a judging function, that they are very secure and they know themselves, and at least they're presenting to the world like they don't have a lot of insecurities. They seem like they're on top of it. Even IPs, they seem like they are very secure in themselves, at least. And so it's not obvious to me as often, unless I know what I'm looking for insecurities from those two groupings. The other two, though, EPs and IJs, it almost seems like we indulge in our insecurities a lot. Like, how many times have you and I articulated some of our insecurities on this podcast, and we just talk openly about them? Like, people that lead with a perceiving cognitive function in their driver dominant position tend to have their insecurities more to the surface. You can see them more often. They're more obvious to you. So it'd be easy to look at the types and go, man, IJs and EPs are more insecure than IPs and EJs. Like, on the surface, behaviorally, or seeing it from the observer side, it looks like EJs, in particular EJs, are always confident, never worry, never have insecurity, always know what to do, are always in control and command, just do, right? From the perspective of us other people. Obviously, that's not what's going on inside of all of us. But I would say there is a manifestation that comes with type based on how you're wired, how obvious it is to somebody else on the outside how insecure you are.
Oh, and I think it goes back to one of those principles we talked about at the beginning, which is that our judging functions are the ones that say how life should be. And if there's anything that is off inside of us, like if there's any question marks we have around whether or not things are the way they should be, if you're leading with a judging or decision-making function, that means your insecurity is leading with its polarity opposite, which is also decision-making. So you're going to try to create as much distance from that insecurity as you possibly can. Whereas for those of us that have perceiving functions, it's more about what we're more focused on the kinds of things that grab our attention and what we're going to the kinds of things we're going to be insecure about. That's going to be more obvious to us. But the insecurities about whether or not we should or how we should be showing up, that's going to live more in our co-pilot and our 10-year-old, or what's technically your auxiliary and tertiary. That's a little bit closer to the surface. I think that we are in some ways more sort of philosophically, I don't know, like open to
EPs, IJs.
Yeah, whatever our auxiliary or tertiary function is. It doesn't matter what type we are. We have more of sort of philosophical tone about those. Like they're more conscious for us. We have more of like a relationship with them. I think that the place actually where our insecurities manifest the most obvious is in our 10-year-old or tertiary function, because it's insecure like a 10-year-old would be, but it's also loud and mouthy like a 10-year-old would be, right? It's got some competency like a 10-year-old would have. Yeah, and
there's some skill there.
It's got an ability to overcompensate too. And so I think when those of us who have judging functions that are extroverted in particular as a 10-year-old, like all of us EPs, we have a tendency to be very vocal about our insecurities. Like, we're more transparent usually. It's hard for us to cover them over, because that 10-year-old function makes us want to sort of shout it out to everybody before they can call us on it. And so we're like the most obviously insecure people. But then at the same time, other types look at us and watch us loudly owning our insecurities, and they admire that. They think that that's actually a sign of strength, when really it's a compulsion that we can't stop ourselves from doing. I wish it was a sign of strength, but it's more just like, I cannot stop articulating what I know everybody else must know. Let me name this deep insecurity of mine. And everybody looks at us and goes, really? That's what's going on for you? And you're like, shit, why did I say something? I should have just been quiet. But it's more of like that compulsion, you know what I mean? So anyway, yeah, man alive, I'm so glad that you brought it down to firm. Thank you so much for doing that. You provided a very important service for me, because I honestly, now that we're talking about this and playing it out, I could go on all day long about how insecurity plays in with our cognitive function stacks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different things.
We could talk about it infinitely. Well, and this is why we got to create some live events coming up, so we can talk about some of these things on a longer timeline with people that come to them and things like that. Like, I'd love to create more avenues for conversations like these to evolve more nuance that's not limited to, an hour podcast as we keep going. And we can continue expanding on these concepts too in the future it's not like we're going to stop podcasting anytime soon as far as I'm concerned. So that's an avenue for that. So I guess wrapping up, I'm assuming you're ready to wrap up, so I'm going to start landing the plane here.
You better land the plane because I said, I could go on forever.
Before we start infinitely expanding these. I think the FIRM model is a really interesting way to start the conversation around insecurity, around personality types. I think once you zoom in on one of those, obviously, and we know this from the chapter we wrote in our book about the FIRM model, where we detail out, like, not all EPs are the same and how their FIRM fixation manifests. And we lay out how those are different based on like an ENFP versus an ESFP, right? There's differences there. So obviously insecurities will be a little different as well. So we're categorically breaking into 4 parts, but then there's 4 parts inside of each of those 4 parts to get all 16 types. And we can start to see some patterns, I think, and you probably listening have noticed some patterns. As we've been talking, I'm sure you've had a lot of ahas come up. Oh, that's right. My husband or my wife is an IJ, and no wonder they have this insecurity. That makes me think about my nephew who's an IP, and you start to weave the stuff together, right, in your life and yourself and where you fall in these insecurities. So this is now your moment. You haven't had a microphone up till now, but we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story around your relationship with insecurity, your personality type, and your life. We would love to hear from you. What's going on in your life? Where have insecurities manifested themselves? Does the FIRM model hold up? Do you identify with what we said in one of those 4 categories? Does that seem to resonate with you as you place yourself in the FIRM model? Are you finding yourself having insecurities around some of those fixations? Are you noticing that your insecurities come from the backseat of your car, of your cognitive functions, or the processes that are your 10-year-old or 3-year-old, tertiary and inferior? Or are they coming from more of the things that you have access to in the front seat? Like, where do those show up for you? I'd love to hear that.
Well, and to harken back to the beginning of the podcast, do you think a lot of your insecurities are coming up with your instincts, your Enneagram instincts?
Also true. Or maybe your age. You're young right now, so you have more insecurities, and as you get older, which is nice to look forward to, and I will identify the older I get, the less insecurities I have.
Oh, it is so nice.
It is nice as you get older, I promise.
It is the consolation prize to your body breaking down.
Yeah.
Like the fact that when I hurt myself, it takes 2 weeks to heal from it.
You're not that old. Jeez.
Well, I mean, sometimes.
You're bedridden for 2 weeks if you sprain your ankle or something? Or
didn't say bedridden. I just said you feel it. You just feel it for a lot longer. And the fact that I can't lose weight as fast, right? Like this whole, it's super exciting to find out what it's like to lose weight after 40. The consolation prize is that you just don't give a crap nearly as much. And so there are some gifts that come with this.
Yeah. I would totally agree with that. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Come over, make a comment, ask a question, leave your story at personalityhacker.com.
Oh, it's my turn.
Yeah, it's your turn. Go.
Oh, no, you said something about social media.
Do I? Oh, find us on all the different social media platforms. I'm almost hesitant to say them all now because in 10 years they may not exist. But Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, we're getting more active on all these different platforms every day. YouTube, we're starting to put out more content and be more active. And it's a great way to communicate. It's a great way for us to have conversations between podcasts, between videos, between pieces of content we put out.
Totally. And my nephew, Dimitri, is now helping us out. So we might be on Snapchat because he's in his 20s. And as a 40-something, I have no idea how to use Snapchat. But he's got the hot take. So maybe we'll be on Snapchat. We'll find out. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. Go get a copy of our book. It's at all the places that I usually talk about. Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble. And I never say that the title of the book is actually Personality Hacker. So that's the name of the book. So if you want to go read it, that's how you find it. Just put in Personality Hacker into Amazon or other retailers.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.